Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Sarah Kotz, Senior Vice President of Programming at The Hill. Thank you all for joining us in person today and online for our event, What's America Thinking? Young Voters of Today, Political Leaders of Tomorrow. Today, The Hill, in partnership with the American University's Sine Institute of Public Policy, will dive into the third annual Sine Institute poll and uncover what young Americans are thinking today when it comes to elected officials and how their priorities could impact the future of U.S. leadership tomorrow. Before we get underway, a few housekeeping notes. If you're with us here in the room, please keep your phones on silent for the duration of the program, but please join the conversation on social media. You can follow us on Facebook, X, and Instagram at The Hill Events using the hashtag Elections2024. And with that, I am delighted to hand it over to Amy Dacey, Executive Director of the Sine Institute of Policy and Politics at American University. Amy.
Thank you. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome on a rainy day in DC, which we haven't seen in a little while. So thank you all for taking the time. We're thrilled to welcome The Hill to American University. Sarah, thank you to you and your team. You have done an amazing job putting this incredible event together. We are so honored to have you here. This is definitely where the brightest minds engage to promote common ground and nonpartisan solutions. And so we're so glad that you're here. We are excited to discuss youth and youth engagement and share some insights on our new poll. I want to thank everybody that was involved in that project. Some of them are here to talk to you today, but I also want to give a special shout out. We brought together 10 students from the university to serve on our advisory group for the poll. They did everything. They did at the front end, they helped design the poll. They did the analysis. They did, talked about did videos and talked about was. Could you just stand for a minute if you all were on the student advisory group and just look, can we thank them really quick? I know some of their colleagues couldn't make it today, but we're so glad to have you here. I also just want to say that we want to welcome everybody that's joining us online. So many of the Sine community, the Hill community is joining us online today, and so we so appreciate you being here. At the Sine Institute, we like to say we are here to convene, communicate, and collaborate. And with that, let's start the program. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Julia Manchester, The Hill's national political reporter, along with Molly O'Rourke, executive in residence at the AU School of Communications, and Doug Hattaway, president of Hattaway Communications. They both worked on the poll and are senior advisors to the Sine Institute. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Amy. We're so excited to be able to collaborate with the Sine Institute. I am an alum of American University, a grad school alum. Didn't get my undergrad here, but was at the School of Public Affairs and actually was one of Molly's former students. So was on the campaign trail with her in 2016 when this crazy road we find ourselves on really started. So it's great to be with you and Doug. Thank you so much for joining us today. Molly, I want to start with you and really dive into some of the polling. When was the survey done and who was interviewed? Just want to get some of those details.
Sure. So thanks, everyone. Is this working? Great. Okay. I'm thrilled to be here for the third annual Sine release of the poll, the first one happening in a presidential year. And so I think our focus this year on how young Americans see and view political leadership is especially fitting. And to answer your question, the survey was over 1,200 interviews, so a robust sample online of 18 to 34-year-olds, and regardless of registration status. So we had both registered and unregistered respondents. And we did oversamples of Black, Hispanic, and LGBTQ plus respondents because we wanted to be able to report out results for them. And I think what's unique about this survey is that we really tried to go beyond diagnosing a problem that we know is there, that people are disappointed and frustrated with political leadership in this country. Young Americans are no exception. They may have a distinct point of view, but we wanted to do more than just document or reinforce that. We really wanted to move to the next stage of trying to come up with some prescriptions or some cures. What would the fix look like?
Doug, we are inundated with polls, those of us that work in politics and in media. We get so many of them. So, and particularly recently on young voters, we know that 40 million members of Gen Z will be eligible to vote in November. So they're a big voting bloc. But talk about how this poll is different and tell us about the top 4 leadership styles that these young Americans are looking for.
Yeah, I was excited to take part in it, partly because my passion in this work is bringing insights from the social sciences to help us understand how to communicate with people, how do people understand things, what motivates them, et cetera. And Molly did some very cool methodological innovations in this, which she can talk about more. But this piece of it was getting beyond looking at policy agendas and resumes to what kind of leaders are young people looking for. And the inspiration from that came from decades of research in political science, which started on what do people look for in presidents. And what the research found was, like, when we're sizing up a leader, and that has since been applied to leaders of all kinds, and even brands, like of organizations. We're not like looking at their resume, or like when people watch a debate, most people aren't sitting there doing a checklist on who won the debate and do I agree on everything. They're sizing them up as people. And it's interesting, those insights were developed into sort of a framework for how do you win trust? How do leaders win trust? So it turns out when we're looking at leaders, or kind of anybody, the sort of our subconscious, the way we judge whether somebody coming into our view, we do 2 things. We quickly assess, often subconsciously, do they mean me well or ill? And are they capable of doing me well or ill? This is like our survival toolkit. And so do I trust this person who's, coming to my view? So the research has fleshed out a number of dimensions, which they call strength and warmth. Competence in leadership meets empathy and integrity. So we can explore, so that's what we did. Well, what are young people looking for when you look at that sort of basket of leadership traits? What kind of leader? And the student advisors came up with their own that they put in the mix, which is exactly how you want to do this kind of research. And we tested 8 different traits, and 4 rose to the top: integrity, authenticity, inclusivity, and compassion. So I'll stop there. We can talk more about those, but that was one of the cool innovations of this.
I'll just add, in terms of the methodology, what we did is with our student advisors developed kind of mock scripts that a hypothetical candidate might make in appealing to voters. And each of those scripts emphasized a different leadership quality or trait, like Doug just described. And then we asked our respondents, because we know young people like to interact with surveys in a way that they're not just responding to kind of batteries and issue lists, but to really make this interactive as part of our effort to come up with a prescription or a solution. So to listen and then to rate and interact with these audio clips. We used an AI generated voice so that it was gender neutral, because I've done a lot of research to know that there are important gender differences when candidates make different pitches. So that was an example of one of the unique methodologies that we brought into this poll to, again, try and kind of get us beyond just, okay, here's the problem, but what are some of the solutions?
I think one stat from the poll that really stuck out to me was 83% of young voters said they were worried about the state of democracy. That's a pretty bleak number. How does this impact, and I want to get both of your takes on this, how does that impact voter enthusiasm? Does it drive these young voters to go out and make a difference, whether they're Republican or Democrat, and really get involved in politics, policy making, or does it make them feel that they should stay at home, more pessimistic?
I'll just jump in and say, I think that in part, that's the challenge of both campaigns, right? Is that there is this anxiety about kind of what's going on with the country. Another interesting finding is that there's a really significant gap when we ask young Americans how they feel about their own future for themselves personally. It's pretty high. But when we ask them how they feel about the future for the country, it's dramatically like 30-point gap difference. And so that anxiety and nervousness can translate a lot of ways. And what we're, I think going to be seeing in the next 6 weeks is really an attempt to harness that momentum and that energy among young Americans and get them out to the polls.
Right.
I think this trust framework gives you a way to assess this. One angle on democracy is, do I trust the democratic institutions? Is my vote going to be counted? Does it matter even if it is? Are the institutions going to respond to me? That's one of the cool things about this. There's insights in there for leaders and organizations of all kinds, including people who are in elective office, to instill confidence and earn people's trust, which goes beyond cool messages. You actually have to walk the talk.
I think you hear both campaigns, just looking at the presidential level, the Trump campaign and the Harris campaign, obviously talk about democracy, but with the Harris campaign in particular, they have made democracy and protecting democracy very central to their messaging. Do you have any insight as to how voters are responding to that messaging, if that's really, or young voters, I should say, and if that's making a difference with them?
One of the things we know from, we did sort of start off the survey. And actually, it would be great if we could pull up one of the slides, slide 1, if possible, that we know that one of the chief complaints is that young Americans feel like elected leaders and candidates aren't listening to them. And so anytime you can kind of have a dialogue that is more responsive to what young people say are not somebody else's agenda, but really their agenda, and doing active listening. I think that was one of the distinctive things that young Americans are looking for in their leaders. And also, we asked about a series of things that candidates could do to demonstrate really kind of strategic or tactical things that candidates could do to say and prove that they're actively listening and experiencing these things. Having, for example, like a youth advisory panel, going out in the community and working side by side with constituents, not addressing them kind of top down, but being part of the community. Those kinds of things that really emphasize being part of an experience and listening and interacting, those were really impressive for young people.
Yeah, that reflects research we did with the Partnership for Public Service, great organization for those who don't know it. It was support public servants. And we did focus groups with people to test like stories and examples of government working. And the trust was so low. It was like, what's the analogy? Anyway, we had to it took like 90 minutes of people hearing actual factual stories and we were doing it on Congress. And one of the most important things to reflect what Molly was just saying, when people heard examples of elected officials actually listening and responding, trying to get something done, that was one of the biggest drivers of trust.
Molly, you brought up an interesting point talking about youth advisory boards, getting into the communities, meeting these voters where they are. And it's interesting, ever since we saw Harris become the presumptive Democratic nominee, there's been, and you see this on the right as well, I'm just going to use her as an example, there's been this groundswell of online energy, whether it was, Brat Girl Summer, Swifties for Kamala. I mean, the endorsement from Taylor Swift itself, there's been a lot of questions as to, how does this play, into the campaign? Can Taylor Swift use her, very unique, massive reach to, reach some of these voters? But that, I don't want to call it noise from online, but that energy online, I mean, are we reading too much into it? Is it more, should campaigns be paying more attention to reaching young voters online where they can reach a massive number of voters, or do they need to put in the time and effort to go into the communities in person?
Well, I think it's ideally it's both.
Both, yeah.
But I think the Harrison Walz campaign has been credited, I think rightly so, for demonstrating or generating that momentum by, for example, when Harris became the nominee, and part of her opening week was listening and understanding, I want to be a president who helps Americans achieve their American dream. And then she's kind of developed an agenda around housing and other things. And also Harris, just as a high school teacher who is used to being able to kind of interact and have conversations in a very authentic, natural setting. I think those things have been really exciting for young Americans to see traits that they don't typically see certainly in presidential and vice presidential candidates.
Doug, one fascinating thing I've learned talking to Gen Z voters, I'm a millennial, so it's great to get their perspective, but they're not as interested in the figurehead or the person. So it's not, from what I've gathered, it's not necessarily the politician. They want to hear that this person is supportive of the issues they care about, whether it's the environment, LGBTQ plus issues, the economy, et cetera. Do you get that? What are the issues that, from what you found in this research, young voters are most passionate about?
I want to speak to the traits and let Molly speak to the issue. She's more on the traits. I mentioned integrity, authenticity, inclusivity, and compassion. And the method was, what's important to you? And then we asked about the candidates. And Harris was winning all of those. So they were seeing a kind of leader. That's what this says. They are seeing a kind of leader there that gives them a lot of confidence. And I think where the trick in these things is stated voting intention of poll does not necessarily translate into going out and voting is the biggest, right? That's the biggest thing. Back to your question, right. Like you have to engage with people in a real way to get them to vote. And the survey went into that. What were some of the obstacles?
Yeah, I would just add that the issue agenda that young people are voting on isn't actually all that different than it is for older Americans. This is an election that is very much about the economy, cost of living, and feeling as though you're going to be able to afford and grow into even modest goals of being able to own a house someday, being able to have a stable career, not have your health care depend on your job or feeling stuck in a job, eventually being able to have childcare and raise a family.
Absolutely. One issue I want to touch on, and this was an issue that many students and faculty on college campuses dealt with quite a bit during the spring, was the reaction to the Israel-Hamas war. A lot of news coverage about the U.S. response to that war and how it's played with Palestinian Americans, with Israeli Americans, Jewish American students. But I thought the finding from the poll was fascinating. 35% said they were aligned with caring about Israel and Gaza, but only 18% said they took action. I just, as someone who's covered the political response to this, I guess I would have expected that to be a larger number. I just wanted to get your take on this. Was this something that, I don't want to say was over exaggerated by the news media and politicians, but, how is this really played among young voters?
Well, I don't want to minimize at all the energy around that issue, but it is with a very specific audience of young Americans. And so, yes, a lot of that was taking place on college campuses. And so it was very visible. And credit to those young people who were speaking out on that. They were extremely smart about being able to, be media savvy and get attention. And so it's not to minimize that at all, but I think you're right that we should put it in perspective, that is not the dominant issue for most young Americans. They are really very much about kind of their daily lives and the support and resources they need to help make their daily lives just a little bit easier.
And you said about 18% said they took some kind of action.
Yes.
Between 10 and 20 is about what you're going to see people actually taking action on issues they care about. So people will care about a lot of issues, but we have limited energy and knowledge about how to take action and that sort of thing. So you often, or it's the data on social media activity too. It's about 2% of the people create almost all the content on social media. About 10% are sharing it and everybody else pretty much observing. That is a decent rule of thumb to think like, so 18%, that's a lot of action. But that's another area where I think there's a lot of work to be done to build trust and confidence with young people, is education and engagement to show people how to get involved in things in constructive ways, which can include protest. Right. And lots of other things that you can do.
Right. We only have a few minutes left, but I have to ask this because I covered Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. What did you get from the findings in terms of how young voters are looking at those two candidates? I know that Harris obviously leads, but, particularly when there were third-party candidates in play, her lead was smaller. Do you think, and I know that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is trying to get off the ballot so he can, be on Trump's team. But you still have Cornel West, Jill Stein. A lot of people would argue that Jill Stein could have played a major role in Michigan, for example, in 2016. How are young people viewing these third-party candidates?
Well, I think I'll fill that in two ways. At the time of the poll, Harris had just ascended to the top of the ticket. And so there was still and I think in fairness still is a steep learning curve that's going on. We've had the convention since then, the debate. So some of those information gaps have been filled in. But when at the time of the poll and still today in polling that's publicly available, Harris has a double-digit advantage over Trump among voters 18 to 34. But I think what's really interesting in that, in our findings, is that we asked early on, before we even talked about the presidential election, what are the traits you most value in a leader? And then once they prioritized or rank ordered them, then we talked a little bit about the presidential race. We had them go back and rank order who was better on each of those issues that they prioritized. And Harris had a pretty substantive lead over Trump, so that this is not just kind of, she kind of had a good rollout, or we think she's really killing it on social media. They really see kind of substantive things that Harris stands for, that they care about and prioritize.
Yeah, and it was on all 8 traits.
Yes.
She was well ahead on all 8. And interestingly, those who said they saw those traits in her were more likely to vote than the ones who were rating Trump highly. So there's a little bit of Harris advantage on voting intent there. Again, you got to do the work to turn intent into action. But I was like, oh, wow, she's got a little advantage there on stated intent to turn out.
Interesting. And we'll be watching as we get closer to November if these, the poll numbers across the board, the young voters just in general, I'm assuming it's going to get more narrow. So we'll be looking out for it. Molly and Doug, thank you so much for your work on this poll, for joining me on stage. Thank you so much to the Youth Advisory Board as well. I mean, that's just such hard work as students. So I really want to commend you guys for that. Before we exit the stage, I had the opportunity recently to sit down with Congressman Jake Auchincloss from Massachusetts' 4th Congressional District. He's a Democrat and told me about how he thinks young voters will impact this election and the work he's done in his own district to engage with that voting bloc. So we have these screens over here and you guys can take a listen to that. Thank you. Congressman Auchincloss, thank you so much for joining us. Just to jump right into this, we have really seen a sea change among, voters in general, particularly Democratic voters and young voters, from when President Biden was at the top of the ticket to now that Kamala Harris, the Vice President Harris, is at the top of the ticket. It seemed that younger voters in particular were somewhat less enthusiastic about Biden at the top of the ticket, but now there seems to be so much excitement with Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket. What is she doing differently here? Why are they so much more enthusiastic about her?
There's no question Kamala Harris has closed the enthusiasm gap in the Democratic base. Joe Biden, when he was at the top of the ticket, was underperforming with voters under 30, with voters of color, and basically overnight, that enthusiasm gap closed. I think there's a number of reasons. One of them is that it felt like Washington was listening. There was this building anxiety about the age and acuity of the president and about his ability to win in November. And it sort of felt like people weren't listening or responding to that concern. And then all of a sudden they were. And as Nikki Haley said months ago, the party that changes the top of its ticket will win the election. Democrats did it, Republicans didn't, and I think Democrats will win the election because of it.
Right, and moving into the election, I know that Democrats seem very enthused across the board about this idea of young voters being, energized Generation Z voters. So many of them are first-time voters this election cycle. But just looking at data, and I'm looking at a U.S. News and World Report survey, it found that 48% of 18 to 24-year-olds turned out in 2020 while nearly 80% of voters 65 years and older turned out. It seems like younger voters are less reliable than older voters. How do you guys flip the script on that? How do you guys, essentially, how are you able to make sure that these voters turn out in November or even before November through vote by mail or voting early?
I don't think it's realistic to flip the script entirely in one election cycle. This is a generational project. Younger voters have almost always turned out at lower numbers than baby boomer, or I should say as the older generation voters have. And that's a persistent trend that I think would be unrealistic to say, oh, we're going to flip that script in the next 2 months. But we can boost turnout in this election and then going forward. I think there's a number of ways to do it. One, yes, early voting and vote by mail. I think grassroots organizing, in the 2020 cycle, because of COVID, that was, I think, discounted. But knocking on doors, which is how I got my start in politics, and digital relational organizing, where you have individuals reaching out one-on-one to others to talk about why they support this issue or why they support this candidate as people, can be very effective. And there's a pretty good corpus of political science research that demonstrates that. So I think that we need that grassroots approach.
So, I want to dig in on that a little bit. How do you reach these young voters? You often hear that, they're on TikTok, they're on Instagram Reels, they're on social media, but, they're also on college campuses. They're also in other communities. How should campaigns target these voters, and how do they find out really where they are?
I think this is a question not just for younger voters, but for all voters. In the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, the United States media was in an unusually concentrated moment where it was a few broadcast channels, a few newspapers that were able to set the agenda and control a huge amount of the medium. That's no longer the case. And in some ways, that's actually reverting back to how U.S. political discourse was structured in the 19th century, where there was lots of different organs of communication, such as the case now. You got Discord channels and Reddit threads and TikTok and Twitter and in-person events. The short answer is there's just no shortcut. You got to do all of it. I mean, that is really what campaigning is about. You have to go wherever voters are. And that is one of the intentions that I have as I'm out there as a surrogate and as a campaigner myself, both for Kamala Harris and for my Beyond Thoughts and Prayers political action committee that's dedicated to a gun violence prevention majority in Congress, is just go reach people wherever they are consuming information.
Right. And, just to talk about the issues voters care about, you mentioned one right there, gun violence. Obviously, voters across the age spectrum care about this, but I know for younger voters who are going to school, this is obviously a very personal issue. When you're in Massachusetts 4th Congressional District, what other issues are young voters, Gen Z voters, millennial voters telling you they're most concerned about?
Gun violence prevention, as you indicated, is a top tier issue, not just for younger voters, but for all voters. And we have a suite of policies that will save lives. It is not a fact of life, as J.D. Vance claims. This is a matter of politics. And if we win the election for the House, for the Senate, for the presidency, we can enact things like a federal assault weapons ban, like universal background checks, like safe storage laws that will save tens of thousands of lives. And I think that young people feel that imperative. The other big one is cost of housing. It's the single most important domestic policy issue in the United States, and it's particularly poignant in Massachusetts, where we are paralyzing our economy because young people cannot afford to buy a house and they can't afford to live near their employment base.
So one issue that seems to have really hit a lot of young voters seem to care about, they feel passionate about, there's two sides to it, obviously, is the Israel-Hamas war and the U.S. response to it. A Pew Research poll, this was taken in April prior to President Biden dropping out, found that 36% of 18 to 29-year-olds said that they believed Biden was favoring Israel too much, while 12% said they believed he was striking the right balance. We know that Kamala Harris has been the vice president during the Biden administration. A lot of this is an extension of his policy, but how do Democrats walk that fine line of hearing out both sides of this issue, hearing out, young Palestinian and Arab Americans who are upset with how the U.S. has responded to the war, but also hearing out, the other side, the Israeli side, and also, the side of Jewish Americans who feel that they have been targeted through anti-Semitism?
Yeah, I think it starts with rejecting the premise that Israelis and Palestinians need necessarily be on opposite sides, that there have to be two sides opposed to one another. I am pro-Israel and I am pro-Palestinian because I believe that both peoples can and should live in security and dignity and prosperity. What I am against is Hamas. I am against an internationally recognized terrorist organization that took 6 young hostages, had them record videos to their families, and then shot them execution style. And I think we have to maintain our moral clarity as political leaders and as a country that says, we want no part in what Hamas is offering. And if you're out there protesting, waving a Hamas flag, you're wrong. But also say that, of course, we want the Palestinian people to have the dignity and security of self-determination. And those two things are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they are synergistic. I think the other thing we have to recognize is that as much oxygen as this issue has consumed, it is not a voting issue for the vast majority of Americans and frankly, the vast majority of young voters as well. When you look at what people walk into the ballot booth thinking about, it's cost of living, it's reproductive rights, it's immigration. There are 3, maybe 4 highly salient issues upon which this election will pivot.
Finally, Congressman, the partisanship in DC and the political discourse, as you and I both know, has gotten quite negative. And I think a lot of Americans, including young voters, feel very turned off to that. Is there a fear that these young voters will sort of want to block out the noise and stay home instead of, turning out and going to the ballot box ahead of November?
It's incumbent upon elected officials like me to demonstrate integrity and stewardship of the Constitution. I would also, though, say it is a challenge to this generation of Americans to not view democracy as a spectator sport that they can tune out of or change their channel on, but instead get engaged. You don't like how Washington is operating, then organize. If you think that there are issues that need to be changed, then go run for city council or school committee. But most of all, you got to go out there and vote. I think we're going to see, and I'm excited to see Gen Z help to rebuild some of the institutions of trust in this country, whether it's local news, whether it is local government, and whether it is the way the political parties operate at the state and federal level through things like ranked choice voting or nonpartisan primaries, for example. We have a lot of different levers to press on to rebuild trust, but my challenge to Gen Z is don't complain about it. Don't be cynical about it. Come help change it.
Congressman Jake Auchincloss, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your insight.
Good to be with you.
We now go across the aisle to hear the view from congressional Republicans. Julia spoke with Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis, a Republican from New York and vice chair of the Problem Solvers Caucus, which aims to foster bipartisan solutions to tough issues. Take a listen.
Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us here today. I just want to introduce you, I think, a little to our audience. You're the vice chair of the House Problem Solvers Caucus, which is a bipartisan group of members of Congress organized to get to help solve some of our country's most pressing challenges. Just to start off with, what lessons have you learned by reaching across the aisle on these tough issues?
Well, we're in a very polarizing period in our nation's history. And unfortunately, a lot of times things that you don't think are controversial somehow become controversial.
Yeah.
I remember I was one of 13 Republicans who worked with Democrats to pass our infrastructure law during my first term. And this was critical because the funding from this infrastructure package, particularly for an aging city like New York that I represent, where we have needs for roads, bridges, our ferry system, our sewer system is very outdated, and many other things, maritime industry that supports so many jobs. This was critical, but yet somehow after this bill was passed, we got death threats for voting for roads and bridges. Like, who thought that was going to be controversial? I think a lot of it is explaining and making sure people understand what's really in these pieces of legislation. Sometimes there are just people who are out there giving misinformation of what the bill does, what it funds, what it could be used for, and making sure that we inform our constituents about these things, I think, is a real key. Making sure that people understand facts, both lawmakers who are voting on these pieces of legislation and the American people who are paying, right? They're the taxpayers. They deserve transparency and they deserve to know. I think that where we can, we find common ground. It's very unfortunate that so many things have become difficult because there's pressure from the far left or the far right to not solve some of our nation's problems. But I think for the most part, we can find common ground. And yes, it's true that we want to take the country perhaps in different directions. I mean, we're very focused on border security, on public safety in our streets, on reducing inflation, those pocketbook economic issues, right? Being able to afford to put gas in your car and food on your table. Where, our colleagues may have different priorities, but where we can find common ground, we should really try to come together. And when we disagree, we hold the other side accountable. That's the way it should be working in a debate. We do it in the media, on the floor, but not to attack people personally, but to do it in a respectful manner based on policy.
And you brought up that partisan environment we see obviously on Capitol Hill, but quite frankly, across the country. And we've seen that a lot of young voters in particular, we see that they're, fired up to an extent, but there seems to be this trepidation, this nervousness, and also just sort of this negative feeling about the idea of getting involved in politics, whether it is running for office or voting or organizing, canvassing, etc. What would you tell young voters in your district, or young voters just in general about, how would you convince them or encourage them to become more involved in the public service and political space?
Well, look, I think that it's important to remember that, you get the government that you vote for, right? If people want to see changes, if they want to see accountability where there isn't any, it's up to them to hold elected officials accountable. And then, you know what, if they don't like somebody, they should replace them. But they should be holding elected officials accountable. And that starts by engaging and knowing how your representative is voting. It's a representative can come to you and say they support the police. And next thing you know, they voted to defund $1 billion from the NYPD. So you have to match what they're saying with how they're actually voting on these really important issues. So that would be my number one thing. Number two is, I got involved at a very young age. I was a high school student. I was a junior in high school. The reason why I got involved was because my mother fled a communist country. She fled Cuba. She's very passionate about being able to elect our leaders. And that really motivated me and got me involved in, the future. Really, we are the ones that are going to determine the future of this country. I mean, do we want to make sure our freedoms, our liberties are preserved? Do we want to go down a path of socialism like we've seen in Central South America, even some countries in Europe? Many of them have had to reverse course because they were not happy on the path that they were on. But the bottom line is, Plato used to say that, the apathetic people who are the thing about being apathetic to politics is that you end up being ruled by evil people. That was the sentiment. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but that's the truth. When you don't vote, you're not politically active, you're not engaged, you don't know what your representatives are doing, then you are affected. And I think the other thing is that young people know that they are affected, right? They're going to put gas in their car. They're paying $20 more today to fill up their tank than they were 4 years ago. Their interests on their credit card bills are the highest they've been in 2 decades. They're looking to start a family and buy a home. They can't with the mortgage rates this high. It's just completely restrictive and unaffordable. So, they may be concerned about public safety. That's a big issue in my district. Yeah. They have to see what policies led to safety declining and then not vote for those people who put in place those policies.
Right. And, I want to zero in particularly on young Republican voters. I mean, I think there's a lot of data going back decades that would suggest that young voters tend to vote more liberal, but sometimes as they get older, then they start to maybe come back to the center, maybe vote a bit more conservatively. But, with young Republicans in particular, in reaching young Republicans, how is a member, a lawmaker, someone who is involved with campaigns, how do you reach them? Because I get the sense that, we hear young liberal voters, progressives, they're much louder in the online space. And I don't say that in a disparaging way. It just seems like they're a louder voice. But how do you reach young Republicans and bring them into the fold?
I think you got to meet people where they are, right? And that means engaging them. There's a lot of young Republican clubs. There's college Republican clubs. going to where they may be, whether that be a sporting event or a concert in the district. Sometimes there's a lot of different walks that raise money for different charities that you'll see a lot of young people participating with their schools, with their families. So trying to engage them. I'm big on animal rights issues. That's an issue that young people really care about, right? And so I'm involved with a lot of my local rescue groups. And that has, been a great opportunity to meet more young people. Working with my local colleges, we've been able to deliver a significant amount of federal funding for our local colleges and giving children and young people opportunities. I think that that's what this is really all about. Going to like sporting events. We have something where we do a basketball clinic. Things like that, I think, are great ways to engage young people and to hear what they're thinking, what their thoughts are. I try to do it as often as possible because I think it is important to get an idea of what their issues of concern are. And they're concerned with the environment. And we do beach cleanups in my district as well. It's some way that we can engage people. But at the same time, they're concerned about affordability, right? They want to be able to go out with their friends and to travel, and they're seeing, airfares are so high, you can't fill your gas tank. It's becoming too expensive to do things that you would love to do with your friends. Even going out to dinner or drinks has become something that you have to save for the weekends to do, right? So I think talking to them about why everything's so expensive right now. Don't they want more access to things that they can afford? And I think that that's where these discussions about what is truly driving up the cost of everything. While it's partly an anti-energy agenda, so that's number one. It also is a lot of spending that has put pressure on the dollar, spending by government that's put pressure on the dollar. They have to understand, I think, those dynamics. And I think a large part of them do. I think the thing is that, like every American, when you turn your lights on, you just want the lights to come on, right? You never think about the process of how it gets there. But I think it's sort of the same thing with legislation and policy, and some of these issues that you're impacted with each and every day.
What's so interesting about your response is that you talked so much about in-person meetups, meeting voters in person and having that face-to-face contact. And, oftentimes I think when we talk about young voters, people automatically think social media, whether it's, TikTok, Instagram Reels, X, et cetera, the list goes on. Do you think maybe we're putting a bit too much stock in social media for getting these voters engaged? Is it broader than that?
Well, I think social media is really important,
Right,
but unless you're somebody who, unfortunately, is controversial in government, right? You don't necessarily have that type of following that some of the other members who will say outlandish things or, say things just to get attention and clicks, and retweets. And, that's not really my style. My style is kind of trying to be a little more of a centrist, trying to govern. But yes, talking about issues that people care about, right? Affordability, animal rights, access to education, crime and public safety. These are the things that young people talk to me about. But yeah, I use my social media. It's a great tool. It's a great way to get out there. But if you don't have the followers, like some of the bigger names that are controversial and actually end up are the ones who are most extreme, then you really don't have that type of following to get that message out as effectively.
Absolutely. It's all that, those forms of communication, very important. Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis, thank you so much for joining us here today.
It's great to be with you. Thank you.
Now it's time for our panel discussion, Strong Candidates and Bridging Divides, with our panel of experts, Layla Sadin, President and CEO of the Future Caucus, Naomi Miguel, Executive Director for the White House Initiative on Advancing Education Equity, Excellence, and Economic Opportunity for Native Americans and Strengthening Tribal Colleges and Universities, and Patrice Willoughby, Senior Vice President of Global Policy and Impact at the NAACP and a 2024 Sine Fellow. Welcome.
Well, Patrice, Naomi, and Layla, thank you so much for joining us here today. We appreciate it. So I think at the time when we were putting together this event, the 2024 race looked a little different. It looked a lot like the 2020 race, and there were two old white men running for president. Now you have, Kamala Harris, obviously a South Asian Black woman running. You have Tim Walz, her VP, much younger younger, 60 years old, and J.D. Vance, who is the vice president on the vice presidential nominee on the GOP side, much younger, I think under 40 or just turned 40. So, I want to get all three of your takes on how this has really shaken up the race. It seems that now with Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket, Democratic voters in particular are energized. So I just wanted to go down the line, starting with you, Patrice. How has this shaken up the race in your view?
Well, first of all, thank you to American for inviting me here today. It's wonderful to see so many young people in the audience. In politics, relatability is critically important. And I think that too often politicians speak political speak. And the shift in this year's election has really energized the electorate because with the addition of Kamala Harris, there's a candidate who's extremely relatable.
Naomi Miguel. Good afternoon. My name is Naomi Miguel. I think for this question, I'm going to kind of relate back to my community. I was raised by a single mom, raised by my grandma with a lot of strong Native women. I went to an all-women's college in undergrad, and so women have always been empowered and seen in my eyes. So it's really great to see nationally that we're starting to put women back up at the top and in leadership positions.
Well, thank you to American and to Sine for having me. I'm Layla Zayden with Future Caucus. And listen, I'll point us back to the poll that we're all here for, right? The number one trait that young people said they were looking for in their elected leaders is integrity and then authenticity. To your point about somebody coming into the race that people felt like they could relate to, or at least in a lot of ways disrupted this really stale, static matchup that we've all seen before with a new generation, a younger person. She could have passed for a millennial in my eyes. I didn't realize she was that age when she became the nominee. But I think when Vice President Harris became the nominee, it really disrupted something that felt old and inauthentic, and sort of replaced it with a matchup that I think brought a lot of joy and a lot of forward-looking momentum to the conversation.
Right. And Layla, you mentioned traits in particular, and I want to get to the issues. Obviously, we know that the issues are very important to this, but do you think, based on, I know you work with an organization that works to get younger people to run for office, and be lawmakers, how much does personality play into this? I mean, it seems that going back to 2016, a lot of these elections have been personality based.
Yeah, well, so the reason that I got into this work is because my parents were born in Morocco. They immigrated to this country, and I grew up really proud to be an American. And what was behind that was a love of the opportunities that I had that my family in Morocco didn't. Sure, it mattered that the candidates who were making those decisions were relatable or looked like me, or I felt like I belonged. But at the end of the day, what they were doing mattered so much more. And I think when I look at our politics today, I see two problems. One, we don't have enough of the younger generation, young, diverse leaders who can get people excited. But then the ones that are there, and the 75% of state legislatures right now are older than 45 years old, are not delivering results in ways that make us excited to participate in our democracy. And so personality matters, but once you do, when you're in that chair, the political leadership of the people we elect matters so much more, I think, to young people and to people everywhere.
Naomi, I understand that you're fresh off the campaign trail. You were just in Arizona, a major battleground state this election. What did you see when you were on the ground?
So Arizona is a unique state, as all of you know, but it has a very unique history, specifically with Native American voting. I'm not sure if you're aware, but I wasn't considered a citizen of this country until 1924. So only 100 years ago. And even with that citizenship into this country, we were not able to fully vote. So in Arizona, we had two landmark cases that really helped Native Americans be able to register. The first one was in 1928. That was in the Gila River community. They put in a case, but the ruling of that case said that we weren't considered citizens of state and local governments because we were tribal citizens. It wasn't until 1948 where there was a Harrison v. Levine case on the state level that allowed a former World War II veteran was denied the right to vote, and because of that case, we are now able to vote today. So if you think about it in hindsight, that was only 72 years ago. So some of your grandparents may be that age. Your grandparent is a visual of my right to vote in Arizona. So I think when we're talking about these important landscapes and states, we shouldn't really exclude any of these Native voting communities. We always talk about Native Vote, and I think that's the event that I went to this weekend. We were able to see some of the grandchildren from some of those landmark cases still making the case of making sure that we register to vote and still telling our youth that they have a voice through their vote. At the event too, I was able to talk to some youth. They were very excited to actually start voting, but then there was also some youth who were very skeptical about voting. So it was an event that was very culture-based. So it didn't look like a voting, your regular voting rights or voting registration event, and it was very much culture-based. So we had a lot of traditional dancing. I'm barely getting over being sore from dancing. And so I think when we start thinking about our democracy and thinking about communities of color, that's going to look very different. And I think that we're starting to see that more represented in our government.
I think being sore from dancing is probably a good problem to have, maybe. Patrice, on representation, Black voters always play a pivotal role in every single election, but just going back to 2020, it was, remarkable to see in the primaries how, Congressman James Clyburn was able to galvanize many Black voters behind Joe Biden. And then in the general election in Georgia in particular, how Black voters showed once again, in many ways, they are the backbone of the Democratic Party. I wanted to get your sense as to how the NAACP is working to mobilize Black voters this general election, but in particular, young Black voters.
So in motivating voters, we have to remember that relationships between people in community are critically important. And the NAACP focuses on relational organizing. So that is person to person. We have recruited about 100,000 volunteers over the past couple of months. And we are deploying those folks all across the country and in priority states so that people talk to their neighbors. People talk to members of their church, as well as young people talk to young people. We just completed a poll as well, 14.5 million Black voters. We'll be releasing data on that as well to identify the issues that are important to the electorate and also the messaging and how it's important to speak to those voters, because every message is not for every community. So for example, when we focus on intermittent voters or low propensity voters, voters that are not in every election. We know that the issue of economy is critically important for young people. Higher than that is racism and discrimination. And so how do we talk about and link the importance of voting to those issues that are at the top of people's minds?
The poll that the American University and the Sine Institute did, I mentioned this in the last panel, it showed 83% of young voters said they were worried about the state of the democracy. Obviously a pretty bleak number. And it seems that the political environment in this country is very bleak. I mean, just take this past week as an example, a lot of ugly, untrue claims about immigrants are being voiced at high levels. And then you have a second assassination attempt against a former president and a candidate. I want to get all of your take on how the climate is playing with this voting bloc. And I asked Molly and Doug this earlier. Is it this motivating young voters to get out there and make a difference, to turn this around? Or in your experience, is this show young voters want to, they want to tune this out? They don't want to listen to the noise and the ugliness of all of this. Layla, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I know this question of like, well, oh man, things feel so exhausting. Why is that? And you gesture wildly to everything around us. And it would be understandable if young people decided that they were going to check out. It would be the most rational thing if young people decided they were going to sit this one out. And instead, we're seeing them run towards the fire. We're about to release a report as well that we've been tracking year over year the number of young people running for office. And I'm optimistic that when young people today are seeing the problems and the gaps between what's happening in our institutions and what they want to see done, they're no longer just sitting back and waiting for somebody to come in on a white horse and save them. They're raising their hand, they are throwing their hat in the ring, and they are running for office. And so I feel like this is a call to action to young people, and young people are answering the call. Now, the second part of that I would say is it's not enough to just get more young faces and diverse people in office. Recruitment is only half the question. Retention is a big piece of it too. How do we help support younger leaders once they're in office to be the kind of political leaders that we know young people want to see, who have the ability to be open-minded and to work across the aisle on solutions? How do we support them in developing? And so I'm really optimistic and excited about young people this election cycle and in the future. And I think the big call to everyone is how do we help support them and keep them in office to help them have impact?
Naomi, what's your take on that?
I think we're seeing a generation that has been deeply impacted by our voting. I say that in a sense from the Native youth perspective. With Native youth, especially Native youth who grow up on tribal reservations, you have to deal with the federal government layer of government. You have state level of government, and you have local and county levels of government. We're already talking about 5 layers of government. And then that's not excluding your tribal government setup. For my government, an example, we have 3 different layers. We have our village government, we have our district government, and then we have our overall tribal government. At that point, you're at 9 layers of government. So when you're talking about Native youth, they're always activated in voting, activated in being involved. And I think that that's holistically an Indigenous way of thinking of community, where we are accepting of both youth and elders and being the participating party in developing our government. But I think that that is now being seen on a national level. And I am very excited to see what our youth get involved in and see them excited to be out there talking to each other or even, messaging each other on social media. I think there's an energy there that we're going to see develop even bigger, and I'm very excited to see it. I think that our youth are going to be able to really develop ways to change our government, mainly because they've been impacted so early on of a lot of these policies.
Tracy, you've worked for lawmakers and have been involved in organizing. What does your experience teach you, or which direction does it guide you in this moment?
So I think we have to look back at history, and both millennials came of age during the financial crisis of 2007-2008, and then were growing into adulthood during the Obama years. Gen Z, right after, has seen that there are discrepancies between what politicians and electeds say and what they do. So if you sort of put those things together, people have gotten the message that being engaged, activating, being an activist is really useful activity. But social media and other influences have showed people that they need to really engage in order to move the needle. So the question then is how? Clearly, I think that a lot of our messaging about the importance of voting has gotten through. But I also think that because young people don't have the context of history of seeing the democracy go up and down, that is the vulnerability that causes people to disengage. So, historically, at the NAACP, we of course believe in that arc of moral history continues to go up. We have experienced a slight downward period in the incidence of hate, the disengagement from people, but I also think seeing the engagement within the past month and the interest of so many young people, I think we're on the upswing again.
And Patrice, were you at all surprised at just the groundswell of engagement and enthusiasm there was for Vice President Harris? Just looking back at history, we haven't really seen anything like this before.
Well, we saw it in 2008 with Obama.
Okay, there, yeah.
And I think that young people, we should never make the mistake of thinking that young people are not paying attention. Young people pay attention, they read, and they watch what's going on. They understand that aspects of the political system are really broken, and I think that they're seeking answers and ways to fix it.
I guess I should clarify. So when Biden stepped down and Harris, sort of presumed her spot at the Democratic ticket, was that surprising to see that that groundswell of enthusiasm surround? It just seemed like it was night and day.
What was surprising was that there was not a circular firing squad among Democrats, and that often I think, and I could make generalities about both political parties, but I've never seen such rapid coalescing of opinion and enthusiasm rolled into the shift in candidates.
Right. Layla, you do a lot of work to recruit young people to run for office and to, seek office in state legislatures and U.S. Congress. And it was interesting. There was a memo sent out by the Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee earlier this week, and it showed that 20% of their spotlight candidates, and as we all know, there's a lot of state legislatures, 20%, that's a big number, are young people. They're under 40 years old. That's compared to only 6% of members of Congress, and there's only 2 governors under the age of 40. I mean, that's such a big number. Do you think in terms of engagement and getting these young people to, maybe go beyond voting and seek public office, does it start at the local and state level?
Oh, absolutely. I think that these are the roles that are often uncontested, actually. There are thousands and thousands of elected positions across the country, and a majority of them do not have an opponent. And so if a young person is looking for a way to have impact, the easiest way to feel it is in your community. It's the fastest way to create direct impact. And more than likely, there's an open seat to actually challenge. Future Caucus was founded because we saw political polarization as the single greatest threat to our generation. The more that people cannot agree on how to move solutions forward, the more nothing happens and the more our generation gets left holding the bag. And, I think there's a lot of reasons for us to distrust government, our democratic institutions, and I think to actually feel at a local level what it is to be inside of a governing body, that also gives you an opportunity to make it really visible to other young voters. And it's, I had a mentor tell me once, you can't talk your way out of a situation you behaved your way into. Can't talk your way out of a situation you behaved your way into. It's very good advice in general, but it's very true when it comes to losing the trust of voters. And so if we're going to earn that trust back, you have to behave in a way that earns that back. You have to deliver results. And I think at the local level for young people, it's an incredible opportunity to actually make that impact felt.
Naomi, I think unfortunately a lot of issues impacting Indigenous communities in the U.S. and North America and around the world, quite frankly, go undercovered by the media, by lawmakers. We've seen that Interior Secretary Deb Haaland has done a lot to draw attention to a lot of these issues. But what issues are most impacting these communities? What issues would you like to see changed in these communities?
Well, I think for Native youth, one of the top 3 issues that I hear from them is looking at climate change. Indigenous communities are deeply impacted by climate change, especially up in the Northwest and Alaska. They're feeling the impacts right now. There are villages that need to be moved because the erosion is happening. The second point that they always bring up is looking at mental health. When we're talking about looking at our history with the United States and looking at the impacts of the boarding school and what that has had with our generational trauma, a lot of our youth are very in tune with that and wanting to get more mental health abilities available for our communities. The last one is also international issues. The fact that we have social media and internet at our fingertips, a lot of our youth are very engaged internationally and wanting to get involved with helping other communities as well. So I think those are the top 3 issues that we see. I do want to just kind of note, you mentioned Deb Haaland. I used to be a congressional staffer, and I realized before she was elected, her and Sharice Davids, there was nobody in Congress that looked like me, and there was nobody in the federal government that looked like me. And so when we keep in mind historical ways on ways we can change things, that change didn't happen for Native women until 2018 and 2021. So that's all this century. So I think when we're talking about communities of color and wanting to have change, I think that change is now, and I think that our youth are ready to step up and make that change.
Well, Patrice, Layla, and Naomi, thank you so much. Before I let you guys go, we do want to do some Q&A with students and attendees here. So if anyone has a question, please raise your hand, or do we have one right here?
Hi, thank you. So one question I have is actually regarding the Native American communities. As you know, they're right now like autonomous communities in the tribal areas, and it's all spread out. Is there a way to do more voter registration across for the tribal federation elections, in the sense that, the tribal leaders are elected by the community? So is there a way to get young people out to vote for and to get them to stand for positions of elected office? Because since the young people there relate to the young people here, for example, Gen Z, because we're all so familiar in diversity and unity, Indian diversity, what strategies do you think we can take to have the tribal federations see more voter turnout for those elections?
That's a great question. The Biden administration has an executive order on access to voting. Within that executive order, there is a steering committee that was created to specifically look at Native community barriers to voting, and they created a report. And in that report, it doesn't mention, as you mentioned, a lot of transportation issues. So, for instance, my tribe is equivalent to the size of Connecticut, but not everyone there has a car. So when you're talking about voting locations, I think what everyone here can do on the ground is look at, if your community or county is near a tribal entity, how are you engaging that tribal leader and its community to making sure that voting locations are equally put so that people can access them equitably. A lot of my tribe, and my tribal leader was at the event this weekend, by the way. And so my tribe, all tribal leaders are very much engaged in making sure that our Native youth are involved, but also making sure they're registered to vote. I think another part of that is making sure our local and state governments are engaging our tribal leaders on what the tribe wants and where the tribe needs those locations to be.
Being that a lot of the momentum that started to pick up around the Democratic Party's campaign happened after the announcement of Kamala Harris being the being the presidential nominee, happened mostly because of the unknown sort of that she played, not knowing like where her policies would align, created a little bit of an excitement. So is it possible that there might be a little bit of a backslide with younger voters as she starts to align herself with more of Biden's more unpopular policies surrounding young voters, like Palestine and his immigration policies on the border?
I think that in any election, there's always a honeymoon and then there is fallout. So if that's seen with Kamala Harris, it will be very similar to any other election. That having been said, one of the reasons that it happens is because it is the whole idea of context. So who had civics in school? Just a few people had civics in school. So the whole idea of how government works, how it operates, what candidates and what politicians are actually able to do versus what they promise to do, there isn't a real good level set around that. So I think that it is inevitable that there will be some walk back from the honeymoon phase. But I also think that that's where it's incumbent upon folks who are voting to understand all the levers of government, the political process in order to contextualize that.
I also think that you see polls sometimes that'll match up, a specific person on the right, and then it'll say against a generic Democrat. And then that number's higher than the matchup between a specific person on the left. And I think it's because there is no person out there that is going to satisfy what even just the people in this room all want, right? There's no perfect person that can encapsulate all of that. And so you start to see like drop off, right? When there's an issue that you're like, this is not okay. And then that person steps back because a person is imperfect and is going to have policy ideas that are at odds with some subset of people. I do think that that's where the leadership traits become really important, right? And so are you looking for somebody who's willing to be open-minded? Are you looking for somebody who's willing to listen and compromise? And does that become the more important driver of earning your vote versus maybe some specific policies that they have? And I think each voter has to make that trade-off for themselves, but that's where I see sort of the gaps and the opportunities is leaning into some of those leadership traits.
Hi, my name is Natalie. I'm a first-year Master of Public Policy student here at American. My question sort of ties into, hopefully, from the discussion about the Sine poll in the beginning. So Patrice mentioned a lack of historical perspective for youth voters, leading to pessimism and disengagement, which was a really interesting point and I think really salient for youth voters. And this was sort of reflected in the Sine poll, that youth have a frustration with leaders not listening to them or not talking about issues that are important to them. And then Layla also mentioned the threat of polarization. So how do you all think that youth voters should be thinking about the balance between integrity and authenticity, which were top qualities from the poll that youth voters desire, and balancing that with consensus building and governing across the aisle? So my question is, how should youth voters think about that, and how should candidates walk that tightrope as well?
I think this is such an incredibly important question because when I read the characteristics in terms of integrity being the highest value, I think there is nothing to negotiate when it comes to integrity with someone who's in political life, because you've got to believe what the person is, that they're going to do what they said that they're going to do. But our political system developed in a place that is a little different than we are now. Everyone believes that generally that they're right, that they have the right to have everything. And so our political system is based on compromise. And so compromise, the ability to govern, is critically important as well. Authenticity is great because nobody wants to be around a phony politician. But if someone is authentically screaming horrible things, or they represent values that are not aligned with yours, then that authenticity has limited value. So integrity, and I think the ability to govern, is critically important, because most legislation, no one ever gets what they want wholesale. and compromise has to become part of the system again.
I think one of the hard things is a lot of the very unsexy work of our democratic institutions is actually connected to some of the problems that we all think are most important, but we just don't hear about them or talk about them or feel like we got to give our opinion on what they should do about them. And so I think my advice, and certainly this is what we try to do with Future Caucus and building bipartisan coalitions of lawmakers working on issues, is how do you co-create, how do you invite people in earlier in the process on those topics? You know, we heard a couple housing, there's all sorts of things that are really, really important to people that involve kind of unsexy, like zoning reform or like, you know, pretty boring things. How do you meet people where they are? How do you make people feel like they belong in the decisions that are being made on their behalf? And how do you demonstrate, not in a top-down way, I think Molly mentioned that earlier in her panel about like not always being top-down, but actually bottom-up, inviting people and working on those issues. And then the outcome is going to be bipartisan. It's going to be a community-driven, cross-partisan outcome. It's a lot harder to do, and it's kind of sometimes a little unsexy because, like I said, nobody wants to like go to a, you know, dance party about zoning reform. But I think good leaders are the ones who figure out how to make it compelling and how to build a bigger tent around those specific issues.
I just want to share a story. It's not specific to voting, but I think it's more specific to leadership and having leaders in these positions. When I first got into this position, the first week I met with the Secretary of Education, and in his office he said, okay, what are these top things that you want to do for Indian education? And I listed out all the things that I was able to see happen during the pandemic, things that I even myself experienced as a Native student growing up. And he said, okay, I want you to forget all of those things, and I want you to talk to the stakeholders and talk to your community and find out what they want. And that's the type of leadership that we need. I've been very grateful to work for two different people who have that idea, and that community needs to be involved in our development of policy and government. And I think the more that we create that type of structure in our government, the better we have at getting all of your opinions into our government and being active. I think that's the other piece I'll say. A democracy requires us to have an active constituency. And so I think we need to have both to make sure that we have an equitable and government made of integrity.
Okay. Hello, my name is Jada. I'm a junior political science and sociology student at Howard. And we're here with the Howard University Coalition for Good Trouble. Just like to say thank you so much again for having us here. And so we've spoken a lot about young people, and I really want to shift it a little bit to incorporate the intersectionality of young people into this discussion, focusing not just on the fact that we're young, but also race, sexual orientation, gender, just where we're at geographically in the nation. And so a lot of young people, especially young people of color, are registered to vote. Already we have been pre-registered since we were 15, 16 years old, depending on the state. And at Howard, we've been leading a voter registration effort for the past 4 weeks. And so I want to ask how do we focus or shift our narrative from focusing only on voter registration, which a lot of young people are, into actually a language that's enticing and influential and empowering to get people actually to the polls? What strategies in terms of language, but also actions need to take place within our universities, within our churches, within our community groups that's not already happening right now?
I think you can center that a little bit on issues. I know, at least in my family, because we very much do talk politics at the table, we talk about different issues and where people are. And I think that kind of has lost sight a little bit, but I think it also includes being able to talk to your peers, but also talk to your peers respectfully and understanding that we may not have the same opinions, but that's also why we vote. So making sure that we're educating ourselves on the different issues, but also that we are talking to each other and holding each other accountable at making sure we're making action in our democracy.
One of of the things that I loved about the Sine close-up poll was the focus on asking people sort of their opinions on a range of issues and how it affected them. I think the way that you engage those conversations is by starting at the point of agreement in terms of what are people's interests. And then it's kind of a step backward to reverse engineer to how you get there. Because at the end of the day, the policy overlay is the false choice that people have been told they have to make, in that the interests of older people are opposed to the interests of younger people. One of the reasons that if you look at policy, so much money flows upward to upper income and upper age limit cohorts is because younger people are not really represented in that discussion. But if you look at the interests of younger and older people, it's economic security. So that's the point where that discussion really has to take place, because it's going to look different if you're younger or older. But what young people also have to understand is that not voting is allowing others to make those decisions for you. And the only way that the systems change are by that continual engagement.
Thank you so much for hosting this discussion today. My name is Rashida Hassan. I am a first-year MBA student at BU. And I had a question specifically. It was kind of piggybacking off of what the young lady from Howard just asked, but it was specifically related to ways that millennials and Gen Zers can garner support from local nonprofits on the ground, on the state level, when we are bringing forth solutions to address voter engagement for our age range, but we may not be supported by those leaders who may be the presidents or the CEOs of these nonprofits that can make change. What piece of advice would you give to, or would you share with us that may come forth with solutions but may not be supported from those leaders in these roles?
So can you clarify trying to get like nonprofit leaders to help in voter registration drives or voter turnout drives?
Yes. So if there are a group of millennials who may have an event and ways to engage their own generation of people, and they're bringing their, for me, I want to partner with the nonprofit, but I've noticed that there's a bit of pushback from the leaders in the different nonprofits who are focused on voter engagement, but I don't know if it's because I'm a millennial bringing this forward and it's not the person that's over the organization or what, and how do I break beyond that barrier during this time, which is very crucial.
Yeah. I mean, you got to show them the receipts. Like, you have to demonstrate that you are credible, that you are power building, and that you have value, right? Like, you know it. The people that you're organizing know it. And I think it goes back to the, like, you can't talk yourself, or you can't talk your way out of a situation you behaved your way into. You need to show them actions that you have led, that you can do to demonstrate what is possible and what is capable. And I would say if you're running up against a no with somebody, that's not a reason to just like give up, but there are other ways to build coalitions that then just build power sort of without that person. It's true inside the legislature, it's true outside the legislature.
Thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you so much to Molly and Doug and to everyone who worked on the Sine Institute poll. And Amy as well. Thank you so much. You are obviously a critical part in this, and to our partners at the Hill as well. Thank you so much to everyone, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
We believe at the Sine Institute that what you do when you leave the room is actually even more important than having this conversation and participating today. So I really hope that everybody will sign up for the Sine Institute's newsletter, social media. Please connect with all of the Hill has to offer. It's really important to stay, engaged with them and make sure you're getting their programming. The recording is going to be available instantaneously from, this event today. So think about it. If there's a couple people you can forward this along to and share and say, please, read this. There's a lot more that we can do after the event as well. I think it's also important when engaging in a conversation with someone who has new and different opinions than yours. Try that. There's certainly opportunities to do that. And I do think that, again, I want to just thank the Hill so much for their partnership with the Sine Institute and American University. And please, if you want more information on the poll, it's definitely available on the website and here today. And thank you again for everybody joining us online. If you'd like to join us, we're going to have some refreshments and keep the conversation going outside now. But please, let's go forth and communicate and collaborate. Thank you so much.